There is a word for the bias that single people face: Singlism. It was coined by social psychologist Bella DePaulo, who spent decades researching how single people are perceived and treated compared to their coupled counterparts. What she found was striking. Single people are routinely assumed to be lonely, immature, or emotionally damaged. They are passed over for promotions because they are seen as less stable. They pay more in taxes, more for housing, more for travel. They are asked, with barely concealed pity, why they haven't found anyone yet. The assumption baked into all of this is that couplehood is the destination and singlehood is the waiting room. That being in a relationship is the default healthy state, and being single is a deviation from it that requires explanation. This pressure starts early. By adolescence, most people have already absorbed the cultural message that romantic partnership is not just desirable but necessary. That to be chosen by someone is to be validated as a person. Films, music, family gatherings, social media. Every channel reinforces the same idea. Find your person. Complete yourself. What this does psychologically is profound. It means that millions of people spend their single years not actually living them, but apologizing for them. They frame their singlehood as temporary, as a problem being worked on, as something they hope to move past soon. The stigma doesn't just come from outside. Over time it gets internalized. And once it's inside, it starts shaping how a person sees themselves. Understanding that this pressure exists, and that it is a social construction, not a biological truth, is the first step to understanding why people stay single and what that actually means for them. For a significant number of people, staying single has very little to do with not meeting the right person. It has everything to do with what closeness feels like at a deep, unconscious level. Attachment theory describes the patterns we develop in early childhood for how we relate to other people. Those patterns, formed in the first few years of life, tend to follow us everywhere, including into our romantic lives as adults. People with an avoidant attachment style have learned, usually through early experiences with caregivers who were emotionally unavailable or dismissive, that depending on others is unsafe. Closeness feels threatening. Intimacy triggers anxiety rather than comfort. When a relationship starts to deepen, something in them pulls back, not because they don't want connection, but because at a foundational level, connection has been associated with disappointment or loss. These are not people who are consciously choosing to avoid love. Most of them want partnership. But every time it gets real, every time someone gets close enough to matter, the psychological alarm goes off. They find reasons the other person isn't right. They feel suffocated by normal levels of contact. They value their independence so intensely that any encroachment on it feels like a threat to their identity. The important point is this: attachment patterns are not character flaws. They are adaptive strategies that made sense at some point. But they can keep people stuck in cycles they don't fully understand, wondering why the same thing keeps happening, never quite seeing that the common denominator in every situation is themselves. When someone says they're single because they just haven't found the right person yet, are they being honest, or are they protecting themselves? High standards are real, and they are healthy. Knowing what you need in a partner, refusing to settle for someone who doesn't treat you well, being unwilling to force a connection that isn't there, these are signs of self-respect, not dysfunction. But there is another version of high standards that functions very differently. This is the kind where the goalposts keep moving, where there is always something not quite right, where potential partners are evaluated and disqualified on technicalities, where someone who looks perfect on paper is ruled out because the feeling wasn't immediate and overwhelming. Psychologists call this relationship perfectionism, and underneath it, almost always, is fear. Fear of being hurt, fear of vulnerability, fear of losing yourself in someone else. The high standards become a socially acceptable explanation for staying safe, because nobody can argue with, "I just have high standards." It sounds like self-worth. It can actually be self-protection. The self-sabotage pattern goes further. Some people unconsciously seek out partners who are unavailable, already in relationships, emotionally closed off, geographically impossible. The attraction to the unavailable person is not a coincidence. It allows someone to experience the feelings of wanting connection without ever having to risk the reality of it. The longing feels real, the safety is built in, and the staying single feels like bad luck rather than a choice. Not everyone who is single is avoiding something. Not everyone who stays single is wounded, or waiting, or self-sabotaging. A growing body of research shows that many single people are not just coping with their situation, they are genuinely flourishing in it. Self-determination theory identifies autonomy as one of the 3 core human needs. For some people, the level of autonomy that comes with single life isn't a compromise. It is a source of deep psychological nourishment. They make their own schedules. They invest in friendships, work, creativity, and personal growth without having to negotiate every decision with a partner. Their lives are not empty. They are full, just full of different things. Research has also found that single people often have richer and more varied social networks than married people. They tend to maintain stronger connections with friends, siblings, and communities. Contrary to the cultural image of the lonely single person, many single people have social lives that coupled people quietly envy. There is also a distinction psychology is increasingly taking seriously: the difference between people who are single by circumstance and people who are single by orientation. Some people genuinely do not experience the drive toward romantic partnership that most of the culture assumes is universal. They are not broken. They are not in denial. They simply experience fulfillment through different channels, and forcing themselves into relationships they don't want does not make them happier. It makes them, and the people they're with, miserable. The real question: are you single because of who you are, or because of what happened to you? That is not a question designed to make anyone feel bad. It is the most useful question a person can ask themselves, because the answer changes everything. If you are single because you have built a life that genuinely sustains you, because you have not yet met someone who fits into that life in a meaningful way, because you know yourself well enough to refuse to settle, that is not a problem. That is clarity. But if you are single because somewhere along the way you learned that love is dangerous, that closeness leads to loss, that depending on someone means giving them the power to destroy you, that is worth knowing. Not to judge yourself, but because that wound, unexamined, will keep running the show. It will disguise itself as standards. It will disguise itself as independence. It will feel like freedom while quietly keeping you trapped. Childhood shapes us in ways we rarely choose and rarely fully see. Past relationships leave marks we carry into new ones without realizing it. The patterns established before we were old enough to question them tend to persist long after the circumstances that created them have disappeared. None of this is destiny, but none of it resolves itself on its own either. The most honest thing psychology can tell us about people who stay single is that there is no single answer. Some are healing, some are hiding, some are genuinely, authentically choosing a life that looks different from the one they were told they were supposed to want. Some are all 3 things at once. But here is what is true across all of it. The relationship you have with yourself, how well you know yourself, how honestly you face yourself, how much compassion you extend to yourself, is not a consolation prize for not being in a relationship. It is the foundation that every other relationship, if and when it comes, will be built on. You cannot truly choose another person until you have genuinely chosen yourself, and that work is never wasted, regardless of where it leads.